Welcome to my channel. My name is Antonio Yerbasoni. I'm a Peruvian composer and university professor, and this is the second video in my series on music composition, which aims to introduce you to some key aspects of this wonderful art. In this video, I'll explain the similarities between human verbal communication forms and music. An analogy that I use a lot in my composition classes is one that compares music with speech. There are other common analogies, like comparing music with architecture, but I prefer speech to all of them. In fact, a term widely used among composers and musicologists is musical discourse, which implies that listeners feel the music as a kind of talk, even though it really isn't. Let's say that I have to give a speech on some topic. The normal thing would be to start with some kind of presentation. I would start by introducing myself and then briefly mention the topic itself and how I plan to discuss it. In the same way, many musical pieces have an introduction, the purpose of which is to introduce some musical ideas that will be developed later in the piece. Then I deal with the topic in question in various ways, and perhaps introduce a second topic whose purpose is to serve as a contrast to the first one. Likewise, in a musical composition, I would present an idea in different ways and introduce other secondary ideas to provide some contrast. Finally, I would close my speech with a kind of conclusion or epilogue, and in the same way, most compositions end with a closing section, generally known as a coda. None of this should surprise you. After all, it stands to reason that music mimics the way humans communicate, even if it's not really a form of communication, at least not by itself. An important aspect of musical discourse is coherence. Just as in formal communication, ideas are presented in an organized way and no random concept is suddenly introduced out of nowhere, we do the same in musical composition. Composers are very careful so that no outstanding material slips around unintentionally. In my example about giving a speech, imagine if I suddenly started talking about a topic that has no relation to the one I mentioned at the beginning. It wouldn't make any sense, right? In the same way, every prominent idea in a musical work must be related to a previous one, and if I introduce a new idea, which I can of course, I'm forced to develop it so that its appearance is justified in the context of the piece. Another one of those terms that composers and musicologists use a lot is narrative. Music develops over time, so listeners usually get the feeling that it's telling a story of some kind. The sonata form, in its basic version, for example, is often related to a kind of narrative. There's an introduction. Then, in the following section, known as the exposition, the first theme, the first character, is introduced, followed by the second theme. They collide in the development section, both trying to assert their primacy. In the recapitulation, both themes return, but the second in the key of the first. It has been altered. It has been subdued by the first theme. Finally, a coda closes the piece. For many, this form seems to represent some kind of conflict, and in some pieces with this form it clearly feels that way. In the Romantic period, many composers liked to create music based on a character, fictional or real, an object, a place, a poem, a novel, and so on. It became a very popular fad that gave rise to the term program music. Of course, Vivaldi had already done this in the Four Seasons, but it wasn't until the Romantic period that it became popular. In this period, the tone poem, a term coined by Liszt, was invented, a completely new genre that remained in force until the beginning of the 20th century. However, I would say that it's still very much alive today, in the sense that many modern composers write pieces that could be described using that term, myself included. It's just that we all avoid using it. As I said in my previous video about music composition, Western musical development has created a kind of code, a language of sounds that can spark ideas in the mind of the listener. Take for example birds. That's easy, right? Just ask a flute to play a trill and you get something that sounds like a bird. Some composers have even transcribed bird songs almost verbatim, such as the obvious cuckoo in the introduction to Mahler's First Symphony. or the singing melodies in many works by the French composer Olivier Messiaen. Then there's a code, almost a cliché, for religious settings, such as the introduction to Romeo and Juliet by Tchaikovsky. Or some passages from Debussy's The Sunken Cathedral. There are also typical ways of referring to pastoral scenes, such as many passages from Beethoven's Sixth, or these sections of Smetana's The Moldau. As a last example, there are also various ways of representing the macabre, which can be found in pieces like Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, or Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain. There are many other codes in Western music. There are, for example, typical ways of making an allusion to pirates, the sea, the wind, the moon, and so on. Lastly, there are ways that we normally represent human emotions in music, of which I really don't need to mention any examples. The term musical discourse is just a convention to explain the fact that we process music in a similar way to language, but there is no actual discourse in music. Although I mentioned that coherence is important in music, it doesn't mean that music cannot exist without it. In any case, it can be said that music that seems to lack coherence can present difficulties for understanding, but a composer could find justified reasons for writing music like this. Many composers refute the idea that their music reflects any kind of narrative, and that may be correct from their perspective, but this doesn't prevent the audience, at least in part, from building in their mind a personal narrative for said music. Musical codes are not universal or static. They vary from culture to culture and change over time. The code, or cliché, for death, for example, was different before Chopin wrote his funeral march. It was a Gregorian chant known as the Dies Irae. Thank you for watching this video, and subscribe to be notified when I post a new one. I give private lessons online on composition. If you want to know more, click on the linked video or visit my website. The link is in the description below.